Okay, excellent. Good turn up for such an early session. I hope you all had your coffees so that you're bright awake. Welcome to this session called Implementing AppV 5, Lessons Learned from a Production Rollout. For people who don't know me, I'm Ment van der Plas. I come from the Netherlands. I work for a company called Login Consultants. I'm an MVP as well as some of the other folks I see around here in the audience, and I walk around here at the event. Today I will be talking to you about a customer implementation I did with AppV 5 when it was still in early beta, which means we had to start up this tab program with Microsoft so that we can actually have support. So just by raising hands, how many of you have actually used AppV 4.6? Okay, so not everybody, but most of you. So just to give you a heads up, this session will contain some AppV related topics. So I cannot, really go back to the basic stuff. So I will be focusing more on the stuff that has changed compared to the prior release. But general familiarity with the product is actually preferred. So. But I will be around this session, so after session, if you have any questions, I will be more than happy to answer them. So my goals for this session is to give you an overview of the relevant changes that were made to Microsoft AppV 5. I will also talk to you about the design process that we did for this particular customer, focus a little bit on the environment and the infrastructure that we've built there. And of course, I will share with you some implementations challenges that we had or are still having, pitfalls and gotchas. When it comes to the changes in AppV 5, how many of you have been to yesterday's session where Tim and I did an overview of the changes in AppV 5? Okay, so most of you have. So we've talked about some of the stuff that has changed, like there's no dedicated drive letter anymore with the new client. There's no 4 GB limit anymore for the package. User settings are stored more transparent to the system, as you can actually see them in the registry or in the file system. We have rich PowerShell scripting. I will be doing some demos which will include PowerShell. And it also now has a rebuilt infrastructure component which has a web-based management console. The italic ones I will be focusing on a little bit more in detail, which is actually good because yesterday we actually ran out of time to actually discuss some of those components. So there's a little bit of overlap, but bear with me. So if we look at the AppV Client in BASIC for the people that haven't played around with AppV 5 yet, basically, from a functionality perspective, the AppV environment is still the same. So the applications are isolated, but there is more exposure to the system, which means so you can still have your application running. You would still have things like a virtual file system where you can browse down with the application to a certain folder. And you would see an application having a virtualized folder where if I were to go down to the local system, I would not have that folder. So this works pretty much the same, right? It's virtualization still underneath. If I were to create new folders on the system, they would get picked up by the virtual file system as well, so it's transparent. And if I were to rename them with the same name within the virtual environment, I would have like an override or merge behavior depending on the application behavior. It's actually picked up by the sequencer. So this, from a functionality perspective, this works pretty much the same. Now where it differs is that I can actually browse down to the AppV client, and there's a folder in program data called AppV now, which basically holds what we know as the Q drive, the SFT mount directory. So in here are all the packages that I have published on this machine. And if I sort by date, this should be the one from Adobe. I can actually browse down into that package content and actually see the files on that system. So this is actually where you would normally have to open a command prompt in the Q drive. I can actually browse down to the executable, and I can even run it, if I can find it. And it also runs in the virtual environment. So there's no launcher process anymore involved for virtual applications. So there's more exposure to the local system. So that brought an interesting aspect to the new virtualization environment, is that we can now have what Microsoft calls extension points, or extension points, where we used to have like file types, shortcuts, and some COM registration that would end up on the local system that then we would be able to interact with our virtualized applications. We now also have other components like app paths. I'm not going to jump into all of them. If you've been to yesterday's session, Tim did a great job there. URL protocol, so we can virtualize like Outlook or live meeting clients, where you can click on a URL protocol and it would open up the virtual application. Program access and computer defaults. Applications can register themselves with Windows with their capabilities. So they can tell them, I'm a media player, or I'm another type of client. So this brings us more exposure to the system. So this exposure ends up in several configuration files. There's one actually part of the AppV package in the AppV file of Microsoft of an application. And there are two outside of the actual package which you can customize. So you can customize each of these subsystems. You can add shortcuts, remove shortcuts. You can disable entire subsystems or enable the subsystems if you want to. There's a whole lot. There's some other stuff you can do in those environments as well. I'll come to that a little bit later. You have to be aware that if you apply these custom configuration files, which are fairly similar to OSD files, but obviously in a different structure, they are either applied when the application package is added or published at the client, or if you go into scripts, which I will run to in a little bit, when the actual virtual environment starts. So these config files give us a good customization ability outside of the sequencer process, just like we would with OSD files. Unfortunately, there's no editor for this yet. I've seen one released recently, actually. I think it was even this week, where this is a community tool where you can actually edit this configuration, because obviously, just like OSD files, these are very like error-prone, case-sensitive, and all those kind of things. Another new thing is connection groups. And connection groups allow you, it's like the dynamic suiting composition 2.0. It allows you to merge virtual environments together. The good thing is, compared to dynamic suite composition, was that it's no longer managed at package level. It's managed at like either the infrastructure, or you can apply to the client. If you're using SCCM, they call this virtual environments in SCCM. So even SCCM can manage your application dependencies when it comes to virtual environments. And obviously SCCM as being also a deployment system for local installations, it can also allow you to run virtual applications and install middleware right before it or something. You have to be aware that connection groups have their own identity, which means that in AppV4, we are aware of we are familiar with the fact that the application settings are stored separately from the initial application state. That works the same way in AppV5, but also works for connection groups, which means an application can have its own delta set of configuration, but when an application is part of a connection group, that connection group will also hold that configuration set. The downside is that if you move applications into a connection set, so a connection group, and the connection group does not have any configuration yet applied, for the user this might feel as if it lost its application settings because they are no longer in the connection groups. So that's something to be aware of. If conflicts occur between connection groups, and it can happen when, for example, an application is part of two connection groups, there are several methods which you can use to overcome those conflicts. So you can set priorities to make sure that the correct connection group can actually win. Or you can set the application prioritization inside the connection group. So, and the last thing I want to cover, and I couldn't demo that yesterday, was actually the shared content store. So the shared content store is what used to be the read-only shared cache. Was originally designed for VDI and server-based computing environments, where you don't want each and every host to hold, basically the same or close to the same applications if you have like 100 VMs running on the system. So the good thing about the shared content store, you can enable it on the client, and you're basically done. There's no additional administration you need to do. You can add and update applications to that environment just like you would normally, or with non-shared content store mode configured clients. And the difference is that a shared content or a client that is set for shared content store mode will only download the information that it requires to publish the application. It will not download the stream. It will download the stream, of course, when the application is running, but it will not store the stream on the machine. So this saves a humongous amount of data on the disk. I have an example here from the customer where we have 50 applications that would normally have 12 gigabytes of storage on the VM, and now we only have 587. Well, so the customer was critical, so why do we still need that 587? Okay, well, this is like 95% less storage impact. So I think this is a very, very nice feature. I mean, obviously, if you are dependent now of a streaming server that can actually deliver that content to you, you need a good solution there. So that's where we were challenged. I will come to that in the design process. That's where we were, figuring out how should we configure this environment so that we have a good performance and a good high availability solution. So to quickly show you some of those features, let me start by, close this one up. Let me start by connection groups. I have created 3 packages, plugins to Internet Explorer, and I'm going to add them to this client. So this has nothing to do with, these packages are not configured with dynamic suite or composition or anything. They're not even aware of each other and that they exist. So I've added and published these applications to the client. And if I start, for example, the Internet Explorer with the Java plugin enabled, I can see that the Java plugin is actually loaded. And if I were to start a local Internet Explorer, so the one that isn't running inside the virtual environment, you would see that the plugin don't get loaded. So this is pretty much the same how it worked with AppV4, right? But now I have the ability to run connection groups. So I've set up 2 connection groups that are stored in these XML files. Let me take the one that actually holds JRA. So this is an example of a connection group XML where you can see that I need a group ID or a GUID for the connection group version ID. I can set the priority. 0 is the highest priority in case of any application conflicts. Don't know if you start sequencing your application, start rolling out connection group when everything is 0, you do not have the ability to create a higher priority. So you might, put a bigger number in here from the start, so you can actually create a higher hierarchy package. And I register the 2 applications that are part of this connection group. So I create 2 connection groups now, one that holds Flash and Shockwave, and one that holds Java and Flash. Oops. Oh, it doesn't like that. Enter. what? Is it still running or anything? That's weird. I love live demos. For the ones who has been to the session yesterday, you've seen this demo. Yesterday it worked. Let me try one. Am I doing something wrong here? Oh, okay, whatever. Don't know why this isn't working. So what I was trying to show you, but check out the recording of yesterday's session, is that I have like 2 connection groups, 3 packages. I can show you that one application package gets added to the so the Java package gets added to the Flash package. But if you would run Flash, it was part of 2 connection groups, and so either one of them would win. But apparently, they won't allow me to show you that. So another thing that's pretty cool, that was also part of yesterday's demo, is that you can actually, if you go into those deployment and user config files, there are several things you can do there on top of enabling and disabling extension points, is do scripting, just like we did scripting in AppV 4. The good thing now, or the good thing, one of the things you can do now is actually run scripts in system context. So in this example, I will show you a virtual application that requires a printer driver, and I will install the printer driver locally when the application package is added to the machine.
If it applies to you. Or
First, let me show you that I don't have anything installed at this point in time. Yeah, besides the .NET framework and the required AppV stuff. One of the things you have to keep in mind is that if you want to run scripts, you can add them or change them in your deployment config, but you need to enable the client actually to run scripts. Otherwise, it won't work. So this package is added now to the environment, and I've installed a local printer driver actually to the system. And the nice thing you can also do is, if you would take a look at that XML file again, you can also trigger actions at application removal. So if you're a good packager, you would actually also use this field, so that when the application is removed from the system, it will also remove the printer driver. Now, I'm not saying that your SCCM admin is going to like this, but it is something you can actually use in case you need it. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. No. So the question is, would if you're using shared content store mode, would the printer driver be removed when the application is closed? If I understand the question correctly, there are actually 2 separate things. So first of all, the shared content store, it doesn't store anything. It's doing inline streaming. So only during application execution, all the files, the requests, will be redirected to the stream. So it will not cache anything. The scripts are triggered by other actions. That's adding the application package to the client, removing, publishing, unpublishing, starting a virtual environment, closing a virtual environment. So independent of the shared content store configuration, it will only do that at that particular action. But it's good that you brought the shared content store up, because that was the last item I wanted to show you. These applications that I showed you are actually, this client is configured for shared content store. So the way you can tell that is, I mean, the application the client behaves in exactly the same way. you know, there's information stored on the system because it has to expose stuff. But how you can tell that the application is set to shared content store mode is that the file system, let me pick one that's actually there. Nope, where's Adobe Reader when you need it? There it is. Let me go into the root. Oh, this is not Adobe Reader, but. No, never mind. 2D path. Program files, that looks good. So how you can tell is that all these applications have small x's as an icon. So these files are not really here. The file system doesn't know it. So Explorer doesn't even know it's aware. This is a technology called Sparse Files. So for Explorer, these applications, these files are actually here, but they're not. But if I access them, it will download it on the fly, right? And the same goes for executables. If you run it, it will run the executable. And Explorer thinks the DLL is there, but in fact, it's not. It will open up the stream really quickly. And the way you can, like the screenshot I showed you, one of the ways to actually see that is to go to the properties of the AppV file, and you would see that in this case, I have like the total size of my applications is 410 megabytes. So because Explorer, you know, every file has a file size attached to it, so it just counts it up and it says, well, it's 410 megabytes in this folder. However, the files on the disk, the size on disk is only 6 megabytes. So, you know, Explorer is kind of tricked here. It's not even aware. This is a very low-level trick they pull off. Question?
This content share, did you make a test how it performs when the shared content is on a NAS share with the SMB?
Yeah, so the question is, did we test if the shared content store was on a NAS? No, we actually didn't. But what we did in the design process, we took a shared content store as a given. So we just tried to design an as scalable solution as possible. I will come to the design process in a bit. So we didn't test it specifically.
It's for a non-VDI environment. You understand what I mean? When you have terminal server nodes in a farm, to avoid to have that on every node, you would rely on a NAS share or something like that.
Yeah, of course. So what I said, so the question is, so how would this work in a terminal server environment? You would depend on a NAS share. This obviously moves the, it's a trade-off between impact or storage impact on your system versus storage impact on your network, of course. So I would say, like in a VDI environment, this would save, hundreds of megabytes or maybe gigabytes per VM. So in a VDI environment, that's like 100 VMs per host or something, or 150 or whatever you have. In a server-based computing environment, that ratio is a little less, but maybe the application size is a little bigger. So it's kind of a trade-off if this makes sense in a server-based computing environment.
But in a VDI environment, your shared content would be SAN-based on your system. So the performance would be good because it would be on the same system. Blocked attached storage.
Well. So the question is that in a VDI environment that would be SAN-based, but that kind of depends. So in our environment, starting by the beginning, by the way. In our environment, it was not SAN-based. It's actually dependent on how you design it, but we'll come to that. Where was I? Because the next topic is actually the design process. So to give you a little idea of this customer, so like I said, this was a customer who had about 4,000 clients, laptops. That's a very traditional deployment, laptops, desktops, traditional MSI installations. They had roaming profiles implemented, and they had like 2 primary sites, but within the same city. It was a governmental organization. When I joined the project, they were actually in the middle of deciding whether or not to go for AppV4 or to go to AppV5. So we basically went through the advantages or disadvantages to move in either direction. But that obviously depends on the new environment, because what do you think the new environment would exist of? VDI. What else, right? So why did we go to AppV5? So basically we did a workshop, explaining the differences. So obviously the reduced storage impact was the main driver. They had their VDI environment already, not designed, but they have designed it actually in a way because they already decided to use Fusion I/O for fast IOPS, and obviously those storage cards are pretty expensive. So as the less storage that they could put on those machines, the better. So that was a real big driver. The second one was actually, if you were to go to, so this was a new customer to AppV5. If you were to go to 4.6 now at that stage, you would end up in a migration path, pretty soon after, because it would take them maybe a year or something to migrate that organization. After that, AppV5 will be more and more common. So you had to upgrade them. And some of the metrics around that upgrade process, I will discuss a little later, were already known to us. So there were challenges there. So it was for them, it was easier to just adopt the latest and greatest. I mean, sure, there would be challenges, but there would be challenges with 4.6 as well. So how does their stack look like? Well, I always think this is not your typical application stack. I mean, we have beneath HP stuff, Fusion I/O storage, Hyper-V as a hypervisor, and we had Quest Free Workspace as our VDI solution. We have Zenworks. Anybody using Zenworks? Nobody? That's what I'm saying. Not your typical stack. We have Microsoft AppV, of course. Quest, and we also had Absence, and Absence actually will be part of my slide deck as well, the things that we've learned to that solution, because that solution, I mean, the infrastructure stuff doesn't really touch the actual application users, but Absence would be a very important component in our environment. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Absence, Absence kind of is a user environment management solution, so it can actually capture user data or user configuration from the applications. So it was very important that it would work with AppV5. So the challenge would be, how would these integrate? So because we knew it was AppV5, we first start designing the environment. And of course, if you start designing, you first start to look at documentation. Because we were in a very early stage working with the product, there was not that much documentation about, sizing metrics or, any design decisions. So we were basically, on our own. I mean, obviously we had contact with the product team at the time, but we were basically designing it ourselves. So how would this work? So Zenworks does not have any integration with AppV. So we kind of decided to go at least for the Microsoft native infrastructure. So that holds several components, as I also discussed in the other session. We have management servers, we have publishing servers, we have streaming servers, clients, and we have packages, etc. So the first thing you have to look at in these kinds of environments, so what are the data streams for these servers? So if you look at the package data from the streaming server or down from the package repository, the stuff that you have to replicate, I mean, that's megabytes to gigabytes, right? That kind of size is real. That's a huge amount of data. While the management data is kilobytes. That's XML data. That's not so much. So how often would that data be accessed? So in the case of package data, I mean, this is a shared content store environment. So it would every single application launch and continuous launch would access that data. So that's quite important. While the management data would only be periodically, or log on. Should have said that. Network dependency. Sure, when you launch an application and the network is not there, the application fails. While if you would log on and the publishing server would not be there, I mean, you could still have the information locally cached. But the biggest one is, how would this look like in the future? So would my environment grow? Would my management data set grow if I get more users or more applications? Well, sure, it grows, but it's insignificant, right? I mean, the XML gets a little bigger, but still the amount of data that will be delivered per user would be, fairly small. While the package data, you know, the amount of users grow, the amount of data that would be generated there, or the applications grow, also the amount of data will grow. So this was the first consideration that we did. So we said, okay, so the package data, that's quite important. Management data, it's somewhat less important. So the second one we looked at is actually something that I call the package load state, because obviously, depending on if you have like a laptop and the application is locally cached, I mean, you would have no problem if the streaming server was temporarily down. But this is a VDI environment. So the application, we are familiar with the streaming technology and feature blocks being there, but there's actually a new component part of the sequencer, and actually the default sequencing behavior, if you go to that screen, has changed if you would do nothing and click next. It will go towards something called fault streaming, where there's actually nothing is actually categorized within that data block, and everything is basically streamed on demand. So there's no feature blocks or anything. But the good thing is it would get you the most quickest application launch that you can possibly have. If you do shared content store mode, only this part of the application package will actually be delivered. So this part will only be delivered during execution of the actual application. So the next one we looked at was, and this is probably the biggest one, and yeah, no, there's no documentation, but you basically test this out, is what would be the service disruption impact if one of these servers was down. And we kind of saw that there's a similarity between the publishing server and the streaming server. Although they are different components, we decided to put them on the same box and deliver the same functionality from that single point from the client. One of the reasons for that is because we went to a HTTP streaming process, the publishing server already requires IIS to be part of the system. So we found it very, logical to put the streaming content on there as well. So the client would have like a single point of contact for both the publishing information as well as the streaming information. And that would also help us if we were to scale out the environment and implement more of these servers while we don't need that impact, or we don't have that with the management database. So if the management server is down, existing application can continue to be launched, no problem. The publishing server has the information cached. You can even, add new users to add users to new groups, and that information will flow down to the client. But you will be unable to add new applications or update any applications in the environment. So I would say, the impact there is like medium to low. I mean, I can do without a management server for like a couple of hours, or maybe a day or something, or even longer. Publishing and streaming server is somewhat different. If that one is down, and remember, this is a VDI, shared content store environment with stateless VDI machines. So we need that publishing information every time, and we need that streaming information every time as well. So that impact is very high if that went down. Reporting is, even another topic. I mean, reporting is cached on the client, and at some point we decided not to even use the reporting solution and actually use other solutions in the technology stack for that. So what would be the high-level design? We decided to combine both the publishing and the streaming server behind a load balancer for the client. So we have this instant, single point of contact. We have 2 data centers, and basically contact is replicated throughout that environment. We did decide not to create high availability for the management server. This is also a financial and management impact. And like I said, if the management server is temporarily down, you could either point these servers toward that management server. It's not that much of a load. It doesn't really matter. So some of the design decisions that we made, we went for a separate cluster database. As far as I know, clustering is the only supported solution by Microsoft, but there's no official documentation yet. We got a size calculation from Microsoft. I don't think that's documented anywhere as well. And we basically did standard, backup and restore procedures. Nothing specific. like I said, we went for 2 management servers, 1 on each side. We did not put it high available. We did not create it. I mean, you could, but we decided not to do it. It's not critical in the environment. We decided not to back up these servers. We basically use snapshot technology or rebuild in case of hardware failure. There's no information stored on the management server. It basically gets its information from the management database. So, you know, if it breaks, rebuild it, point it to the database, and it's up and running again. We went for 4 publishing/streaming servers, 2 at each side. We decided to put them behind a load balancer from the start, even if we have no idea, you know, on what the load will be. And that's actually, I think, a general best practice. Even if you do like a small environment, put load balancing solutions in front, it will easily scale then afterwards. It's much harder if you have all the clients configured to one server and then implement a load balancer in front of that, install an additional server, create the set, and then put all the clients towards the load balancer. It's much harder than in this case. We decided to go for HTTP streaming, and we decided to do content replication to DFSR. So a little bit about the load balancer that we used. There were 3 main goals. Obviously, we wanted the best possible performance. So the load needed to be divided, obviously, between the 2 or the 4 hosts. Scalability, we wanted to easily implement additional servers when the environment, you know, would scale out. And we want, obviously, when we don't want any unavailability because that would break down the entire environment and the applications would not run. So this company had an existing Cisco ACE there. We created an active-passive context on each of the sites, so each of the servers could take over. It was very easy, actually, to configure. We found out to measure, you know, availability for the load balancer. It's basically all HTTP traffic, so it's very easy for load balancers to measure that traffic. Just select the right, you know, ports. And you're done. And it kind of depends on the ports. Port 80 would be, you know, the standard HTTP port, of course, for streaming. But the publishing port is configurable in the setup. It's just when you have them both on the same machine, it cannot be the same port. That's the only thing you have to remind. And you have to think about stickiness. And stickiness or device affinity, I think how it's called in Microsoft solutions, is whether or not the load balancer points the client towards the same server during a certain session timeout, or that it just randomizes it. I think for performance, you would probably prefer just to randomize it because you can have the load of 2 or 3 or 4 servers that are behind the load balancer. So that's probably the most optimal performance you get, that to disable stickiness or keep a relatively low session timeout. So some of the other design decisions. We didn't use a reporting server. Reporting is handled by another solution. Just to be clear, like we said in the session yesterday as well, reporting server does not hold any actual reports. It's only like a transport hub towards the reporting database. And other stuff is like, yeah, it wasn't really a decision. The infrastructure was already built on VMware. So unlike the VDIs that would run on Hyper-V, the existing server environment was already based on VMware ESX and shared content store for VDI. So that's a little bit the design process that we went through. It was kind of tough because there are no metrics available for Microsoft. Obviously, Microsoft did some performance testing, but yeah, that didn't really help us in the process. So that's why we decided to go for an environment that would easily scale out if we need additional performance. And I'll come back to performance a little bit later. So some of the stuff that we've ran into, let me start by third-party solution. This was Absence. That was implemented in the environment, and that one was kind of tricky for us because obviously AppV5 was still in beta at the time. And so we went to Absence and we said, well, we're thinking about doing this project, AppV5, what's your thought on that? And they actually hadn't tested with AppV5 yet, but they gave us this, yeah, sure, we will help you on, on an effort kind of base. But the interesting thing is we had absolutely no issues with Absence whatsoever from the first implementation on. It basically, integrated. It could hook into the virtual environments of the AppV applications. It could inject the configurations there. It could extract the information back into the personalization database. So that worked actually pretty easy. And because the executables are now basically exposed to the system, it's just the same process as you would do for a traditional application. You just hook into the executable into your console, and it worked. We did have some additional excludes in the personalization server, so we saw that sometimes the personalization server picked up a little bit too much data. We excluded HKey current user software Microsoft AppV, which is because it's not application related, and also common app data AppV. And since we were also using access permissions, trusted ownerships in Application Manager to prevent users from starting unauthorized applications, we had to exclude some stuff there as well. And this either is already in a newer version or will be in a newer version pretty soon. So that one worked pretty well. So if you look at the sequencing process, so the moment I joined the team, we had about, I think, 50, 60 applications already built by the sequencing team in AppV 4.6. The team didn't, require any, additional skills to handle the sequencer, because the flow in the sequencer is pretty much the same. There's no real change there. Obviously, underneath, everything has changed, so you still have to, there's still a learning curve, of course. We used the package converter, which is part of the sequencer installation. It's handled through PowerShell to actually convert the actual implementation, or the, how do I say it, the actual existing application that they have built. Although the sequencing process was pretty the same, and the conversion process was somewhat successful as well, you have to keep in mind that the package model did have some changes done underneath, and that was kind of a challenge. And the biggest one was because an OSD file is per application, remember those customization files that you now have are per package. So let me give you an example. So these guys were building one application where they had copied out the OSD file into multiple applications and inject a registry key in each of those OSD files differently. So there was the same application but with a different data set, right? If you were to migrate that application, there's no way of doing that anymore, because you can inject registry into your virtual environment just like you could in AppV4. However, XMLs are per package. So for those applications, for that example, we had no other option or create a very advanced script or something, or just to create 4 packages with the correct data sets underneath. So even if the conversion process is successful, there can be some challenges there as well. And let me walk through some of the things that we've ran into. And this is not like an all-on list, but these are the stuff that we found out. So to start with, you need an AppV4 5 package, otherwise the converter won't even convert. Now, luckily, we didn't have that issue, but if you have any like 4.2 packages or anything, you need to migrate to 4.5 first. You need to at least have the OS tag Win7 in there. If you have like Windows XP, the converter will not work. Scripts from OSD files are not migrated to the new script tag in the customization files. So you need to do that yourself. The same goes for the registry. And like I said before, this can be challenging depending on how you've implemented that with your original application. Also, dynamic suite composition is not migrated, which kind of makes sense because there's no dynamic suiting tag in the new XML file because that's handled by the infrastructure. So this is the stuff that doesn't get migrated, but you do get a report on this. So if you migrate these applications, the converter will actually tell you, watch it, I've discovered this registry tag, which is part of your package. I have migrated your package, but the registry tag will not be there. And it says something like, check your application if the functionality is the same. Well, the registry key wasn't there for, without any reason, so it's probably not working. But you can implement it in the new application package as well. So it will also not migrate any feature blocks. It will not migrate your terminate children tag if that was part of your package. and it will also not, if you have added any empty directories to your package, to do tricks with override and merge, making sure that file or folder stayed empty for your virtual environment. Those are also not migrated into your into your new application package. Unfortunately, these are not reported by the sequencer. I would say that this kind of, existing feature blocks, I would say, well, this is low impact. I mean, it's not that the application will not work, and maybe the streaming is not optimized, but it does require you to go back to the sequencing process. The AppV package converter basically converts the the file system in the registry. It does not do any intelligent stuff. Terminate children you can add. Kind of depends, application closure behavior. You could have hanging sessions on your hosted environment. And the last ones are, kind of, not good, not bad. It kind of depends. The new AppV extension points that we've talked about earlier are not exposed for any migrated packages. And it's not reported. But the original package didn't have that as well. So it was like, that doesn't really count, right? If you were to open and save the package in the new sequencer, and the registry information is still part of your package, so you were not too enthusiastic in cleaning the package up, the information will be exposed after you open and save the package. So that's relatively easy. Now these other ones are a little bit hard. Environment variables do get migrated, but I have a screenshot of that, situations where it doesn't get picked up properly for some reason by the application. The same goes for tokenized directories, those CSIDL folders. Those have all changed into AppV new tokenized folders. They do get picked up, but they only get picked up at the locations that the sequencer tokenizes stuff, and that's not everywhere. And one of the examples is, I have it later, if you have like configuration files or text-based INI files, that's the stuff that the sequencer doesn't tokenize. So if you have any hard-coded paths in those locations, those will not be, create new variables in there, and they might fail. And especially this one I like very much, if you have any references to queue in those kind of files, they are very likely to break because there is not even a queue anymore on the new system. So I consider these last three to be pretty high, as the sequencer, doesn't report you on it. And basically you have to rebuild the package because, if you're lucky, you can change that. If you know where that reference is in that application, you might be able to change it. But where do you change it to, right? It's like, okay, there's no Q drive, but where is that file now? And how do I reference it? And how is that created in the sequencer? So first example, this was an application package. It installed something into program files, common files in its own application directory. It created a path environment variable, or it extended a path variable. This is a screenshot of the new XML. And as you can see, it was migrated by the sequencer. Good. It holds the new token files. So this is a new one. If you go into the application package, you can also see that the file is at that location, but the application couldn't find it. So it's like, why isn't this working? File's there, environment variable is there, doesn't work. Resequence the application, it works. Don't know. So this is one of the things where I say, well, what's going on here underneath? This is a hard one. And this one I like very much as well. So I have this application called Bentley Viewer. It says, sorry, I cannot find Q, Ben30, whatever UCF file it is. And if you open up that file, you can see that it actually had a reference to some kind of a workspace engine directory. So these can be challenging because where's that workspace directory now? So we tried changing that to the new location, and the application just wouldn't work as well. And these are tough ones, and especially because it's actually kind of a best practice to sequence to queue. So most likely you have all sequencer applications to queue and maybe have hidden some of these challenges in there. There's an easy way to find this out in your current environment, by the way. Just change your drive letter to R or whatever's free. Start applications. If the applications fail, they probably have some relation to queue there. So those you can put on the list to start sequencing. A question?
The comparison between converted packages with the package converter and new sequence. The implication on performance, did you see something?
So the question is, did I see anything on performance for newly sequenced applications compared to converted applications? I must say that I haven't. No, I haven't, actually. I have here a couple of applications. Let me open up a script that I have created. It's also available on my blog. But there are several scripts out there. Oops, I have to put in the correct path. So this is a script that I created. It's fairly easy. The conversion process is done based on a PowerShell command called the AppV legacy AppV package converter, something like that. Convert from a legacy AppV package. It can run both in informational mode. It can also run in target. Can also run in actual conversion mode. And if you convert, it will give you the information as well as the actual conversion process. So what I do in this script, I basically enumerate through a given source directory. I find all the AppV file, AppV package location, and then I throw each of them through the convert package directory. And I parse everything to a log file. Yes, no problem. Great. Oh, sorry, I have to run this on the sequencer. No worries. Oh, there it is. So, as I said, the conversion process is pretty straightforward. You can automate this and you have a new environment in no time. But finding, the challenges in your environment after that is can be quite hard. So let me check out that log file. Is this the new one? So here it spits out all the issues that I encountered. So apparently my 7-zip package holds a registry key. And it says here, if the package converter detected but did not convert the following registry key. So it did create a new package, but did not migrate this registry key. If the package doesn't function correctly, consider manually implementing the registry. So that's good, because that's actually reported. FileZilla has an OS tag. The package converter detected one of our applications that are targeted for unsupported operating systems. This one, it doesn't even convert. So my script created the folder, but the package does not get converted if that OS tag is part of your package. So Google Chrome holds a script. It's also referenced. ImageBurn holds a dynamic suite composition. All of these are mentioned, but as I showed you in that table, not all of the issues that we've encountered are actually reported. So that can be a challenge as well. So what else did we find? And these are some of my generic findings, and they're not particular to this customer, but may bring you into some issues when you start looking at AppV. So a lot of you guys, a lot of the customers that I run into that they're using AppV to do cross-platform, use the same package, sequence once, deploy many, or however you want to call it. So the challenge with AppV5 is if I have sequenced, so the 32-bit sequencer is able to sequence 32-bit applications, right? And it's able to deploy it to a 32-bit client, but it's also able to deploy it to a 64-bit client. Now, for some reason, we saw that the new AppV extension points are not registered on a 64-bit client if you sequence them on a 32-bit machine. I think that's a bug, because there's no reason why it shouldn't be able to do that. But if you've sequenced on a 64-bit machine, so even if you've sequenced a 32-bit application on a 64-bit machine, it will not deploy to a 32-bit client. You will get an error, cannot configure the package is not designed for the current platform architecture. So there goes your platform, cross-platform possibility. Now, I always personally like to sequence 32-bit applications on the platform that they were designed for, so I always use a 32-bit sequencer. But for example, in building like these demos, some of my colleagues built it on 64-bit machines. So I was very happy last week when I tried to implement all those applications on my 32-bit client and had to go through the sequencer. It's basically opening and saving it on 32-bit sequencer and you're done. But there's a tag in the manifest XML that is part of your AppV file, so you cannot change that, and it's not part of your deployment config file, unfortunately, where the actual processor architecture of the sequencer is mentioned, and the client just respects that. So there's no way to overcome this issue other than if you sequence on a 32-bit machine. General best practice, of course, sequence on the the architecture that matches your client as well. It kind of depends. So another thing that we ran into, and we've had some interesting discussions with Microsoft about this as well, is about not really a new functionality. It's called the primary virtual application directory. It's basically what we used to call like the SFTMNT directory, the Q/8.3 directory. It's now called primary virtual application directory, or PVAD. So traditionally, best practice would be to sequence to Q. Why would we sequence to Q? Because then the virtual file system would be as small as possible, because most of the files would be part of the Q drive, and the VFS would be small for performance reasons. Performance reasons are arguable because this was never proven, and I haven't seen any documentation on it, and I even never had any negative experience with it. And it's even sometimes inevitable. I mean, sometimes applications don't even allow us to choose an installation directory. So the new best practice, of course, is, again, to install as much or as little as possible to the virtual file system and install as much as possible to the primary virtual application directory. But what is that directory? Is that like, so Microsoft tells us that's program files. Okay, because program files would be, the primary directory where the application would install in. Which is true, but there are some gotchas. So first of all, the PVAD question in the sequencer is asked before the actual application has installed, or so it asks you what's the primary virtual application directory, and you say, oh, I think it's program files Adobe. You do program files Adobe. You do the setup, and apparently, Adobe installs silently, and it installs everything to program files Adobe Reader. So you now have an empty PVAD and a very big virtual file system, because everything outside the PVAD, gets referenced to the file system. So it's prompted before the actual installation starts. Now, obviously, if you're a good sequencer, you do a test installation, so you know your application package. But we're under pressure, so sometimes we don't have time for those kind of things. Or, we don't read manuals, we know this application, we just do it. So the second one is the PVAD is actually the directory name is not even relevant, as it becomes root in the application package. So even if I've chosen, a different directory, so I didn't choose C program data, or C program files, but C Ment, if you all would use that, everything would be root in all your packages. You would be just fine. Even stronger, I think that if you choose a directory, I think the worst directory you could choose is program files. Because if you want to do cross-platform architecture migrations, program files directory is not the same across those two machines. On a 64-bit machine, the 32-bit program files has a different name compared to the 64-bit program files. So of all the directories you could choose, I'd say don't use program files. Just use, C apps or whatever you want. And we've actually been testing around with this within the MVP team, and we haven't found any, real issues there. Tim, agree?
Yeah, what I do in my practice is to do C:/packaging.
For example, you could do that. And actually, the actual name is irrelevant. Another thing you have to be aware of, and there's actually a blog post by Microsoft out there, how to sequence for connection groups. And one of the things that has changed if you compare it to AppV4 is that the PVAD directory is not merged if you do a connection group. Now, is that bad? Well, ideally, I would have liked to seen it at least accessible, because traditionally applications could access other application, Q drives So that's no longer possible, but it really depends on how the application is finding its dependent applications. I mean, if the plugins are like in the virtual file system, and it looks in the virtual file system for the file, that will probably work. But if it looks at, you know, this installation directory, or it's mentioned somewhere in the registry and the file is not there, these won't work. And you actually have to not sequence everything to the PVAT, but everything to the virtual file system, or the whole application wouldn't work. Or sequence the plugin together with the main applications. So yeah, there are some, you know, still some challenges, and some, you know, it's not really clear how you should handle it. And I think there's no one good answer to handle this, but these are some of the stuff that we ran into while we were doing this. Shared content store. I really like this feature. This was a key selling point for this customer. Sure, it moved the, you know, the challenge is now with the network and the server, of course, but it reduced the storage impact so much. So that's a very good feature. You can enable it through the through PowerShell. Be aware that it requires a reboot, so this is actually maybe a setting you want to put in the application installation script. Another thing we ran into is the packet source route behavior. So packet source route is what we used to know as application source route. If I were to implement, you know, multiple servers across, you know, whatever the globe, I want to point the client to the correct, you know, closest streaming server. So that's where the packet source route comes into place. You can actually overrule the information that it receives from the publishing server, and it points to the correct, you know, the closest streaming server. Closest, by the way, you have to determine yourself, you know, either through logon scripts or whatever you want. The difference is, and you know, when we ran into this in the sequencing environment, once you've set the packet source route, you cannot add any application anymore from any other path than that packet source route. And that was kind of, why not? I mean, if I've set the application source route, I could still overrule that location if I want to manually add this. Well, so would this be a production issue? Well, probably not. But this was very, the sequencer boys were very unhappy because that, you know, that setting drilled down to their machines, and they had no option to overrule that anymore. Well, actually, there's one option. Obviously, the event viewer gives you a very, you know, clear error message that something's going on with the sequencer package route of package source route. So there's a product source URL opt-out option in the XML file, but it's in the XML file. So how will this work? I would edit that to the directory that my package actually is located in, like ctemp. I test it, it works. I do not move that application to production, because if the, you know, the administrator would use that XML file, then the production environment wouldn't work. So I have to strip that setting again out. So yeah, this is kind of a setting where you want to be careful of where you implement this. And that kind of goes through if you look at group policy. I'll come to that in the next slide. Also be aware that if you've set the application source route in the AppV4 environment, you can immediately go to the console and you can see that it gets applied. It overruled the OSD file. PSR does not get applied directly for active sessions. So this was one of the things we were troubleshooting. We've set the key and we started sequencing, or started running the application, and it will still stream from the other sessions. So these sessions have to time out, or there's a certain timeout. I think it's something like 30 minutes or something, and then the actual key gets applied. Unfortunately, you cannot see what the active key is at a certain point in time. New applications that get added are automatically set to the correct PSR. So setting configuration, AppV now has a group policy management. Oh, sorry, there's a question. So the question is, can you use DFS to determine packet source route? Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. That'll work. So the question was, can you set it through DFS? Yeah, sure. So you set one location and DFS determines the correct one. Yeah, that'll work. Was another question in the back?
It's along the same line. So the packet source route does not get updated real time. Well, failover if that location is unavailable.
Well, so let's say there's a, so the question is, how would that work in like failover scenarios? So if the client is active, so in our environment, the load balancer is the high availability solution. So we have set the packet source route on the client, and if it's, if that location is all available, the load balancer will handle that for us. It's just that if you change the packet source route, in the middle of a client actually running applications, you wouldn't see that it gets applied directly. It's kind of a troubleshooting scenario. It's not something you would normally see in, I think, production environments.
So the packet source route just set the load balancer?
So in our situation, we've set the packet source route to the load balancer server, to the load balancer location. Yeah, correct. So we can now use administrative templates to manage our environment. And these are true administrative templates. So ADMX, they end up in the HKey local machines software policy, somewhere there, so group policy. So they get reverted if you remove that setting from the environment. You have to be aware that if you've set it, so again, this is an example, packet source route. If you've set it through a group policy, the client will take this as the most dominant feature. So kind of, you're in the middle of that packet source route, you try to add a package, it doesn't work, you think, oh, I'll change the packet source route to empty, and then the AppV client tells you, no, I will not do that, because this is a group policy template, and this is drilled down from up, so this is a mandatory setting, so you cannot change it. So you kind of, okay, then I'm done, you cannot do anything. So I like this, don't get me wrong, I like the fact that you can actually override those settings, but be very, careful which settings you should do through group policy, and maybe the ones that might, if you do want to do some troubleshooting on the client to see if there's any issues for, like, I don't know, third line support or anything, you want to exclude those runs from the registry. Oh, sorry, from the group policy. So, last component, server. I think the split between the management server and the publishing server is very good. It allowed us to create a very scalable environment. Actually, in a training course, one of my students actually called the publishing server the read-only management server. It's basically true. It holds, a cached version of everything the management server has to offer, and you can easily scale out that environment. Setup's fairly easy. Still needs documentation, obviously, but that will occur over time. The one thing that we did run into is something related to performance, and in this case, I meant publishing performance. So remember, this is a stateless VDI environment, so the new users that log on need a publishing every time. And I found that not only was the publishing slower compared to AppV4, it's also no longer linear. And that's the one that worried me a little bit, because I had a test environment where I had 10 applications of a size of 200 megabytes delivered, and it took, X amount of seconds. And I had 10 other applications that were larger, and it took longer. So it was not like, the more applications you have, the longer the publishing will take. So that was kind of, I'm still, working with Microsoft, what's going on there. So their observation is, it's because of the complexity of the extension points. So especially COM tends to, if you have an application with a lot of COM objects, it tends to slower the implementation time on the client, because all those COM objects have to be registered in the native window, so that will take time. My observation, as I said, as I also showed you in the graph, is that I think it's also something to do with packet size. Microsoft disagrees with me on this one, because they say we can reach out into that package file and directly get that feature block 1.0 information for the publishing. So that's not the issue. But why do I see why do I see such a big, performance difference in the publishing there? And maybe it's both. Maybe I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm wrong. But just keep in mind that it's not a linear process. No longer, if you have more applications, the longer the publishing time will take. The one I dislike also is during that publishing time, the start menu will flicker. So this is a stateless VDI environment. We have local applications in the base image, amongst which is Outlook. So people log on, they go to start menu, all programs, and the first application, AppV application, comes along, publishes, closes start menu, and the user's like, oh, sorry, closes the start menu again, because at the background it's synchronizing those applications and publishing them. Yeah.
So by publishing, you mean refreshing and starting the first time?
Yeah. So we are still working on performance issues. We are using login VSI as a performance tool. How many of you are familiar with this solution? Okay, a lot of people. Not only for the publishing performance, but we also obviously want to do stress testing in our environment, both from the availability as well as the performance impact. If you guys, you can download logins in VSI for free for 50 concurrent sessions from their website. And there are people from VSI, I think, in the room. So if you leave your email address with Frans, you can recognize him from his shirt. You can get I think 100 concurrent license for that. So what are some of the key takeaways that I want to give you? I think AppV 5 is a very solid future-ready release. Future-ready in the way that ServicePack 1 is out, so you have no excuse to look at it anymore. I know ServicePack 1 is traditionally somewhat of, if ServicePack 1 gets out, that's when we start looking at it. It has a rich feature set with new functionality, but I have to admit, there are many changes. It's not like Microsoft, migrated all the functionality over to AppV 5. They literally built it from scratch. So all the scenarios that, they decided not to put in there, deliberately or not, it may not be there. So for existing customers, I've experienced that can be pretty challenging, right? To find those changes. The impact is primarily in package conversion and migration. I would say take 5 if you're not already an existing customer, because go to 4 at this point if you're not already familiar with it. It doesn't. My personal opinion doesn't make sense. So one last piece of information I want to share with you. Together with 3 other MVPs, we're writing a book, a free AppV book. If you want a copy of that, we're building it chapter by chapter, so it's not ready yet, but it's kind of a free time experience. So leave your email address with me, and we'll be sure to get you the first chapter as they come out. Thank you for your attention, and I think I'm right on time, or do we have time for questions at this time? No, not really. I'll be here. If you have any questions, come up to me or speak to me. Thank you for your attention.